I'd like to welcome up Daniel Jonas from Pay.uk and Luke Wilson from AusPayNet. Thanks for joining me. Kia ora koutou, he uri ahau no Ngāpuhi, ko Chad ahau, he kaimahi ahau ki Payments NZ, tēnā koutou katoa. Hi everyone, I'm Chad Hagmark, I'm the Head of Strategy at Payments NZ. Thanks for joining us for the Perspectives on Global Payments Modernisation panel, and again, Luke and Daniel, welcome. We've got quite a bit to get through on this panel, so we'll jump straight into it. So here in Aotearoa, we're a small but digitally competent nation. Our existing electronic payment system's stable and trusted, moving over $7 trillion a year. However, we need to be looking forward and understanding how we can better support the digital ecosystem and our customers of the future. In this panel, we're going to explore perspectives from around the world and what that might mean for Aotearoa New Zealand's modernisation journey. So we'll kick off with a pretty broad question. And first of all, and I might chuck this to you, Luke, first. Sure. What are the global payments modernisation topics we should be talking about from your perspective?
Thanks, Chad. I'll jump into that in a second. I just wanted to say thanks for the opportunity to be here, enjoying the conference so far, and great to be back in NZ. It's a great country. A lot of the themes have been spoken about this morning already. Interlinking, interoperability, who doesn't want an efficient payment system, who doesn't want a cost-effective payment system. Other things that we're hearing a lot about is resilience, reliability and safety. Obviously, we're a self-regulatory and industry body, so those more conservative elements of payments are important to us. And the final one that I think is a really big topic, which I think we're going to get to in the other questions, is how you manage change and how you move from the old to the new.
Yeah, absolutely. Daniel?
Also, I'm delighted to be here. This is not at all what I expected, and I'm enjoying it enormously. Thank you for having me. I am not going to massively disagree with what Luke's just said. I think, and I talk to a lot of different jurisdictions around the world. I think my last count was 45. And if I sum up what everybody is doing, we're all kind of on the same journey. And there are four main things that I would sum that up as, one of which is that sort of competitive parity for instant payment systems. But in order to get that, there's a couple of really key enablers. One of those, obviously, is protection of anybody that's making a payment, and obviously in the way that everyone would expect. The second one is interoperability, and the place in which that impacts most clearly, and I think this is particularly true for this country, is in that kind of cross-border side of things, international trade. And the final bit is about the destination, and that's a really exciting thing to talk about, and we'll hopefully be saying a bit more of that tomorrow on the session tomorrow. But there is a once-in-a-generation shift going on, and that makes it a very exciting time for you guys to be making your transition to the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I think it leads in nicely to just touching on we're going through a period of substantial change here in our payments ecosystem. We've got a sharp ramping up of regulatory initiatives, which we're also trying to balance with industry-led initiatives that we're working on, for example, open banking, digital identity, and next-generation payments, which actually, quick plug, our consultation paper's out. If you haven't seen it, please jump on the website and grab a copy. Submissions on that close in March, which is a bit of a departure, sorry. So just, I guess, thinking about your respective countries, and it does sort of lead on from what you've just been talking about. What are the hot topics of the moment, and particularly how are they playing out from a practical perspective? So what are you sort of seeing happen? Daniel, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off for that.
So I guess for anybody that follows anything to do with the UK, the hot topic in payments right now is the release last Thursday night or first thing Friday morning of the National Payments Vision, which is a thing we've been waiting for a while, which I actually our response to that isn't out yet, so I can't say anything particularly about that. But I was up all night on the plane to Malaysia writing comments and going, yes, no, maybe. What that is really about is taking stock of where we are as an ecosystem and how we move forward. The UK as a country is constructed of centuries of various types of what you might easily call technical debt. Everything is past dependent. We are where we are because we've done what we've done in the past, and therefore you've got to start from where you are, and you've got to understand what the key hurdles are and where you're going. So doing that clearly is really difficult. And the thing that's really plagued us in the UK is the number of people that have to be lined up and aligned and buy into any change. There are a lot of ducks to line up, and a lot of these are very large ducks indeed. Some of the ducks are not even in the conversation.
No geese?
No, actually, I would say, yeah, you might actually call them geese, a couple of ones that aren't in the conversation. They're much bigger than the ducks.
And I saw a fantastic term in that paper, which was regulatory congestion, which I think might be something that people here are talking about as well over the coming months.
Yeah, and it's something that you're going to see that everywhere, anywhere that's reasonably mature. And I think the difference is people have overcome it in different ways, and there's different ways to break the logjam. You guys have had one way of doing it, and I think you're at an exciting place to be asking that question just when we've been going through the pain for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Luke, if we chuck over to you.
Yeah, so as Daniel just said, we're in a slightly different position, but on a similar journey. The gun's just gone off at a different time for different jurisdictions. Our Treasury released our strategic plan for payments in 2023 and are due to provide an iteration of that next year. That paper really dealt with the modernisation of payments, the reasons for that, how important payments are for the economy, the characteristics of the Australian payment system that the government wants to achieve, and also the need for regulatory review. So that really key acknowledgement that technology's moved on at a rapid pace. There's been a lot of innovation. Regulation was written a long time ago. The Payment System Regulation Act in Australia is decades old. There's legislation out there that still references the use of cheques, so all of that sort of stuff, and we're right in the middle of it right now. More specifically, government is and has been consulting on that licensing framework, so the idea of the same risk, same rules principles. If you're participating in payments, you should be licensed to some degree. We need to right-size that, and government's been talking about different payment functions and how a licence would apply to that. On the payments front itself, Treasury actually let out a media release on Monday around their position on cash moving forward, and also announced that we're going to end cheques. Not a big deal to the local crowd because you've been and done that before, but for us we've been working on that for a long time, and we have something in Australia called the Cheques Act, which made removing cheques, even though the consumers had walked away for cheques in large part for a long time. So we're going to run a coordinated program on that. The position on cash is really interesting, isn't it? Because there's been a lot of conversation about how payments are made this morning, and there's an acknowledgement by government that there is an ongoing role for cash in Australia, and an important one, and they're going to try and provide some more clarity on that. Other really important things that we're looking at is the future of account-to-account payments. So like New Zealand, we have direct entry, which is the workhorse of the Australian payment system, but we also have a faster payment system called the NPP, New Payments Platform, and we're grappling with how we manage the future of that. AusPayNet set a target end date, a conditional target end date for direct entry by 2030, which has certainly got the conversation going at home. So we're right in the midst of some significant change.
Yeah, absolutely. And Daniel, I meant to ask earlier, just around your real-time payments work and some of the re-architecting of that up in the UK, would you be able to comment on kind of how some of that's played out? You're obviously an early mover with real-time payments originally, but now looking at kind of new systems again.
So, as some of you may know, our sort of batch payment system, BACS, has been in since 1968. Our faster payment system, as the sort of first one in the world, I think, went in 2007. we've been running, we're still running checks because, again, we have some similar barriers to overcome. That makes up 23% of the volume of payments in the UK. The vast majority of things go through cards. In order to transform from where we are right now, which is technically a near real-time payment system, it's all about, we've got to get ISO 20022 in. The way, however, in which, the mechanism which we have, and this was very much what Pay.UK was set up to do, but the way in which the mechanism was set up has run into a number of problems with everyone agreeing, basically, and who's in charge of making that determination, not least the multiplicity of regulators. And one of the points the new payments vision, the National Payments Vision makes very clear is that it's got to be much, much more simpler. And we're going to have one guiding mind, just as in the Ghana review, which kicked it all off last year.
Yeah, thank you. And actually that leads nicely, so I might stay with you, Daniel, on that. Just thinking about what's causing friction or challenge in your respective markets and kind of where you see opportunity off the back of that.
So there's a number of things here, one of which, obviously, we have had some, like everybody, some huge issues with fraud, particularly authorised push payment fraud, went through the roof. Like others, we've been tasked with putting in the new reimbursement regime by the payment system regulator. That, I'm happy to say, is now in with an adjusted, and I hasten to say we were just implementing it, we weren't developing it, but had a reduced limit, and that was the subject of a significant amount of industry pushback. But also, actually, one of them has already been mentioned this morning by Visa, which is the proof of concept that we ran, in which they were one of the partners, which was highly successful. This is an industry fraud overlay, and that is the direction of travel, it would appear, in multiple jurisdictions. The other thing I would call out is our early adoption of confirmation of payee. Now, originally when that went in, it was immediately noticeable that all the fraudsters migrated to the places without it. And that gives you some very valuable learning. So first of all, it was then universally mandated. And that is basically what we've been doing over the last year, making sure absolutely everybody has that. But so is everyone else in the world, as far as I can see. This is the first thing they're going to do. It's front of the queue. And all of those things are because of international trade. Eventually, they're going to have to start talking to each other. And that's where it gets really interesting, and interoperability hoves into view immediately.
And what about across the ditch, Luke?
So there's, I guess, the opportunity we haven't quite realised yet, because we're in the midst of significant change. But in terms of the friction, I think there's friction between competition and coordination. I know that came up on the earlier panel, but if you look at some of the markets that have made significant change, and they've been referenced as well, India, Brazil, not all markets have these characteristics, but several of them definitely have the characteristic, which is they were probably behind on the adoption of some of the technology that's become pretty prominent in the UK and New Zealand and Australia. So they've been able to leapfrog almost a generation. They have a population in some instances that aren't particularly well banked, and they weren't carrying the legacy that our markets are carrying. And they have regulators that are willing to be a little bit more directive with their decisions. So not every market's like that, but there's a few key call-out markets that have those characteristics and that we're now referencing as the example. So, I think the key friction point for us is managing the change from the old to the new. And I don't want to dumb it down, but if anyone's lived through a renovation in their own house versus building on a vacant block, building on a vacant block is a lot easier to plan, it's a lot easier to execute, whereas if you're living through a renovation, you've got to consider who's living in the house, where the plumbing is, where the electricity is, how it operates, what it carries, how many rooms you've got to keep going through the renovation. And that's what we're dealing with in Australia at the moment. People access and need cash. Not many people are using cheques, but we need to take care of them and manage that. Everyone in Australia, pretty much every active bank account accesses direct entry. So how do you manage that change from something that has this much capability to something that has this much capability, but there's a crossover? How do you manage that process? So friction of change is a really big one. I think the other one is safety and the hygiene factors. So people really want to get the benefits of that new technology. They want the fast, they want the data rich, they want easy access, but necessarily we need, from a self-regulatory perspective and keeping in mind that balanced view around the user experience, we need to make sure that there's safety in there as well. And the other thing with adopting new technology and more payments going to digital, the other real friction point in Australia is the discussion about resilience. And that's a big one. And that's going to continue, particularly with cyber threats and the potential of systemic interruption to digital payments.
Yeah, thank you. One of the other things that we touched on, I think, when we were talking about this ahead of time was just that investment incentive time horizon kind of mismatch for this type of digital infrastructure. Do either of you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I could go on all day, but it's tough on my suspenders. What Luke said earlier, I would have to completely agree with. When you've got a lot of people who have to move out of their rooms in order for the renovation to take place, you've got to negotiate with all of them. And the more rooms you have, and we have 41 of those rooms in the UK, compared to, I think, about 8, maybe 8 to 10 here, that's a lot more complex. And they've all got to schedule it according to their own timings and their own budgeting procedures, and consent is incredibly important. What I think I could say from looking at modernisation programmes around the world is that the ones that go really well are ones where you always either already have a very, very collaborative ecosystem. So one of the ones that springs to mind here would be Japan, where they've upgraded the Zengin system. They're on their sort of 8th generation right now, and they're planning the 9th generation now. So what they do is the Bank of Japan puts everyone together in the room, they agree what features they want, and then they task Zengin with implementing it, and off they go. So fairly straightforward. And similarly, in places where you've got really strong central authority, we've talked about Brazil. The Banco Central de Brazil is in a position basically to get everyone to do what they say, more or less. And that makes things much easier. They also link it to social benefits. So that was very much the case with PIX, and it will be the case with Drex, their new digital currency. And in India, this was enabled them to basically shine at last year's G20 summit. It's a showcase, and it's part of a national industrial strategy. And one of the things I think I would say is that where you guys are right now is you're at an inflection point here. And if you decide and you're clear what the problem is that you want to solve for the next generation, this can be your platform for growth. And I think that's a really powerful way to think about it.
Do you have anything to add to that, Luke?
Yeah, look, similar themes. I think it's about management of that change process, being aware of the economic impact of that, being aware of the normal pressures that are on all of the businesses that are represented here today. I mean, if you talk to any of our members, they're talking about the existing level of regulation, compliance, normal business pressures, and then you layer on top of that the work that needs to be done at an industry level, and it can become quite challenging. So you just need to be conscious of that. You need to get buy-in. It's really interesting at these conferences, and you talk about different markets and different environments. I'm not sure whether I'm fully in favour of a self-regulatory model when I'm trying to get decisions from members sometimes, or sometimes maybe wish we had a little bit more influence or power. But at the same time, it's great to have the input from those experts out there, not only our members, but also key participants in the market. You know, the panel before talked about the voice of retailers. We have an advisory group which includes retail representation, and you need to keep reminding yourself that there's a reality of business out there while you're driving this change.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we've got a question, so perhaps we can jump to that before we get on to our next one. And please do send questions through. We should have a bit of time for some. So this is, what were the biggest learnings from open banking and confirmation of pay implementation in the UK, which I guess is one for you.
So I think in terms of confirmation of payee, I think I've pretty much outlined that, which is get it done universally and get it done as fast as you can. And for that, you're going to need the regulator to get out of bed and wave his stick or her stick. In terms of open banking, the big learnings are, again, partly in the MPV. It's very hard to do that if you're not clear who's in charge. I would also add that the UK is also the only place in the world, as far as I know, where open banking is separate from the retail payment system operator. And that is because of how it started as a direction from the Competition and Markets Authority for the 9 largest banks to open up their systems, which in a way opened this all up for everybody. But moving on from a specific point intervention on competition to a general enabler, which is what it is now, that's the thing. Understand that this is not just about you, this is not just about what's going on now. In fact, with what's going on and the sort of shift to digital assets, AISPs may actually be more significant than PISPs, because what you're talking about is access to all the information and knowledge that is associated with bank accounts, including specifically what banks have to learn in order to do KYC. All of that stuff is incredibly important. And actually, in Australia, that's already something that people are really benefiting from. So that'll do to start off with, I reckon.
Thank you. I think we touched on this, but one of the big benefits we've got here, I think, with so much sort of change and flux over a short period of time, is having all our cards on the table at once. So I think in both your markets where you've had to sort of work through some of this stuff iteratively, we've got an opportunity to develop a more synergistic, joined-up approach, I think. We also have a lot of examples from around the globe around what's worked well and what hasn't. We've touched on a few examples, but I just wanted to give you both the opportunity to share any other learnings, I guess, or what you do if you're in our position. Particularly, I think, in certain areas you've both been relatively early movers. So, Luke, let's start with you.
Knock down and rebuild. No, we know you can't do that, but in the absence of starting in green fields, I think one of the learnings from Australia is that we've been pretty good at adding things along the way, but we haven't been very good historically of planning what we do with the older legacy systems or payment methods and having a plan for those, taking into consideration what's happening in the market. So the classic example in Australia was that NPP was part of AusPayNet and then was hived off as a separate organisation. When faster payments were introduced in Australia, that was probably a really good time to think about what's happening with account to account more broadly and having a little bit of a plan. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that that could have easily shifted, you know, with a click of the fingers, but I think there could have been some greater thought and planning on what you do with the legacy systems, the characteristics of certain use cases that belong in that payment method versus a newer one that has greater capability and functionality. So, you know, if you have the opportunity to do that, as you think about what you're going to do next, think about what you're going to do with the old, because that can save a hell of a lot of time. The other thing that has worked quite well in Australia, I think, is that whilst government has got more and more involved in payments in Australia and releasing the plan and forming a payments team, their engagement with industry has been fantastic. Our relationship with the RBA is very strong. Obviously, we operate under an MOU with the RBA, but the Treasury team have been really willing to engage with industry, and we've found them great listeners. And I think as government does get more and more interested in payments and possibly creates that vision or that strategic plan, making sure that you've got that relationship and engagement is critical.
So I would say you've got to be really clear about the goal that you're going on. One of the things that people bring up about India is the fact that not only have they got UPI, but they've got the Aadhaar, but the whole thing is one giant India stack. That's planned, and it's centrally planned, which, again, by people that you can't really argue with if you're from that jurisdiction, so that's going to make it slightly easier. But they've got a very clear idea about what it is they're going to do, what objectives they're trying to meet, and they've got a really, really strong local use case. And that is they want everybody to digitise. Again, part of the benefits of that is once you have everyone using digital payments, you're going to have a much more efficient tax collection methodology. You're going to have people connected in a way they weren't previously before. So setting the objectives correctly and clearly in a way that is understandable to the end user. And if I have a criticism of what I've heard today, it would be that I have not heard end users mentioned enough. One of the things that we really do a lot at Pay.UK is we think about the end user. And I've been surprised to find out how many people like us are not really even allowed to do that, often by the Banking Association, unfortunately. But we, for example, run national surveys. We've got a really clear idea about what people's needs and behaviours are and what are and aren't being met. Because the market will not deliver what the market doesn't fancy delivering and doesn't make it necessary. So sometimes you need somebody to hold the space and center the end user so that people can get what they actually need. And sometimes you've got to work out who that might be. Now, we started off this morning with a really, really strong statement of values in the local jurisdiction, and maybe that's a place to build on for me. But who's going to hold that? Really important. So know why you're doing it, know what objectives you're going to use, and then you can start thinking about the function you want to deliver. Don't obsess about the technology, because when it comes down to it, people just want they want it to just work. They want the choice, the control, the convenience, all of these things, but how they do it, right, if they get a solution that works from cards, you'll have to work really hard to get them off it, if that's what you think you need to do for competition.
Thank you. I think to wrap up the discussion, and we'll try and leave a couple of minutes for some questions, I guess a key driver for modernisation has to be a strong strategy. And we have a number of organisations here in Aotearoa, including Payments NZ, who have views on strategy for payments and next steps. But I guess full clarity on who sets and drives this is still a little bit opaque, I think, here. We also heard this morning a little bit about striking the balance between regulation and self-determination, and you've both spoken a little bit about that. I guess, who sets the strategy in your market, and maybe a bit clearer in the UK after Thursday, and who do you think's best placed to do it? Kick off, please.
So on face value, that question is really easy to answer because Treasury published the strategic plan for payments, but behind the scenes there's a huge amount of consultation and input, and what they're doing is they're setting the strategic direction and the characteristics of the payment system that is going to be good for our nation. They're not necessarily setting the way that we're going to execute to achieve that. So it's very much a collaborative process, a lot of consultation to set that direction. And then on the execution side of things, it's more up to industry, and obviously our organisation plays a big role in that.
And that sounds like best practice to me, and it's very much reflected in what we're in what I've seen in the paper, which is by our Treasury department. So, but to start with things, they've got to have a big committee with all the right people on it, and that will be chaired by somebody from the Treasury who will cut through where there are sort of oppositions, I suppose.
Great. All right, we can jump to some questions. So I've got one from the app here around real-time payments. So how important is real-time payments versus real-time confirmation with delayed settlement? If you didn't have real-time payments, where would you prioritise it against other initiatives? Any volunteers?
I was hoping we'd run out of time before we got to the challenge of prioritisation, because that is clearly an issue for everyone in the market. My view is that real-time payments is critical. It's about part of the globalisation. It's about interlinking. So I don't think it's something that any market is going to be able to avoid for too much longer. So I think that, and I think you've got to look at faster payments on two levels. You've got to look at your domestic needs, but you've got to look at the role of your nation internationally as well.
I think this is two different questions, actually. How important real-time is depends very much on the use case. If you are going through a gate line and paying with real-time, it's got to be very, very, very fast. I think retailers talk about the 6-second rule, right, without which you get a queue, and queues are bad. Whereas if you're paying for something, like a fridge, and it's going to arrive in a week, you don't necessarily need real-time payments for that. You might need real-time confirmation that it's going to arrive, but the nature of the risk is different, and that should determine the nature of the payments function that you need to use. And that can also be incentivised in different ways. But I think that's kind of the merchant's job to sort. It's the payments industry's job to give them as many ways to plug into it as possible and make that straightforward.
We've got another curly question up here on the screen. So in New Zealand, the regulators are unlikely to set or mandate the strategic direction. Perhaps some regulators in the room might want to have a chat to some people. Or the North Star. With this vacuum, how could New Zealand set our North Star? Any thoughts on that?
I think Payments NZ has a massive role. If there is that vacuum, I'm not sure that there is, but if there is that vacuum or there's a gap to be filled, then I would have thought the participants in the industry through a group like Payments NZ is the great place to voice your concerns or your view of the strategy.
No, I think I would agree with that. The thing is, I often talk about payments as being the digital twin of the economy. People talk a lot about growth, but growth for what, right? You've got to have a vision about how you want your society to evolve. And this might be as one of the things we've done in the UK has been very much about those sort of recently reinventing national industrial strategy. So we've got certain industries we're very strong at, we invest in those, and then you think, well, we want to grow those industries. Like, really great example, I promised I wouldn't, but I'm going to talk about Lord of the Rings, right? That's an entire industry built on this country as a platform, which didn't exist before. And look at what's come out of that. You've got to think about it more like that. The thing that makes the value generation possible is not the same as the value that is generated. You can't link back from one to the other. So unfortunately, this is difficult because the people who've got to pay for the builds are not the same as the people who are going to benefit later on. It's like you've got to write the book first before you can hire actors and get a script, right? And that can take a very, very long time.
And I think we've got time for maybe a 1 or 2 word answer to this question. Should governments fund payments modernisation?
Depends.
I think if they're users of the system, they should contribute in some way, but it should be spread across all the participants.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's all we've got time for. Thanks, Daniel and Luke. It's been fantastic talking to you. And just a bit of housekeeping, that brings us to the end of this breakout stream. Thanks to all the panellists in this stream and to Julie for opening us up. We're now breaking for afternoon tea, and after the break we'll be back down in this room for our CEO Bank panel. Ngā mihi nui.